If it were you, forced to perform in front of the entire school just to be humiliated, would you stay silent or rise up and let music speak the truth that the system tried so hard to ignore? For 16-year-old Elijah, a black scholarship student at Greywood, he chose to sit at the piano, and with every note, he shattered the silence they built around him. Let's dive into his story and witness how one boy turned prejudice into a standing ovation. Greywood Preparatory Academy. A foggy October morning in the Cascade Range. Elijah Walker walked slowly along the stone-paved path leading to the main academic building, his black backpack resting quietly on one shoulder. The mountain mist hadn't lifted yet. Wisps of thin clouds drifted through the pine canopy, cloaking the campus in an almost suffocating air of antiquity. Greywood wasn't like any place Elijah had ever known. The rows of gray stone buildings, ivy-covered walls, and the Whitmore Hall Auditorium looked like something carved out of a European castle. Beautiful, cold, and completely foreign. He was one of only 4 black students in the entire junior class, and the only one living in the scholarship dorm. At Greywood, a full scholarship was an honor, on paper. In reality, it was a label, a boundary line between them and us. Elijah learned that in his first week, when he walked into the dining hall, tray in hand, and every head turned in unison. Not hostile, exactly, but evaluative, as if weighing whether he belonged on the menu or merely in the room. He was a top student, perfect scores in literature, history, and advanced math. But no one talked about that. Teachers smiled, nodded, then turned their attention to more notable names. The mayor of Oregon's son, the granddaughter of a federal judge, or Carter Langston, heir to the Langston Holdings empire. He walked into class with polished leather shoes and a gaze sharp enough to categorize someone in 3 seconds flat. Elijah kept quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew saying anything would only make him stand out more. Every gesture, every response was measured to avoid drawing attention. He mastered the art of moving through hallways without holding eye contact too long, eating at the last table in the cafeteria, and finishing his homework the night before, just so he'd never be called on in class. At Greywood, being overlooked was sometimes the safest choice. The scholarship dorm sat beyond a small patch of woods, far from the main buildings. Elijah shared a room with Jordan McAllister, a blonde, soft-spoken boy from a family of prominent attorneys. They lived like parallel lines. Little conversation, no tension. Elijah didn't need more friends. He just needed to get through each day without being noticed. In AP US history, sunlight filtered through the windows and cast pale stripes across the chalkboard, catching in the silvery hair of Ms. Harrington, a veteran teacher known for her rigid standards and old-school values. She was part of the legacy Greywood held dear, a voice like a razor and eyes that could separate the substantive from the merely smart. That day, she wrote a quote across the board. "Freedom is a gift, but not everyone deserves it." "Elijah," she said, without turning from the board, as if even she was surprised to have spoken his name. "What are your thoughts on this quote?" Elijah blinked. For a few seconds, the classroom felt frozen. It was the first time in over a month that he had been asked to speak directly in this class. He was prepared. He knew the context. The author had even read a supplemental analysis the night before. So, with a hint of hesitation but a steady voice, Elijah spoke up. This quote reflects a class-based view of freedom. Something that should be universal but is instead conditionally distributed, often along lines of status or race. It's similar to how educational systems have historically excluded certain communities. "Thank you, Elijah." Ms. Harrington cut him off before he could finish his second point. Her voice remained calm, but her gaze had already shifted to Carter Langston, the student who had arched a brow the moment Elijah mentioned the word race. "Langston, any response?" she asked. The class turned toward Carter. He gave a confident smile. "I think if someone's smart enough to get in here, they should also be smart enough to show gratitude instead of criticizing the system." A few soft chuckles followed. Elijah sat back in silence, his hands clenched beneath the desk. That all-too-familiar feeling crept in again, being heard but not listened to, seen but not acknowledged, as if his opinion was just a warm-up act, a performative checkmark before redirecting the real conversation to someone deemed more qualified. That night, Back at the scholarship dorm, Elijah returned to find the chair he usually used for reading by the window overturned. On the desk lay a folded piece of paper. No name, just 4 words scrawled in black ink. Greywood isn't yours. He didn't need to guess who wrote it. Maybe Chad, a third-year student who once said, "This school is for legacy, not for outsiders trying to squeeze in." Or maybe one of his friends, the ones who use the word diversity as a running joke. Elijah quietly set the chair upright. He said nothing, but as he sat down and looked out the window, the glow from Whitmore Hall reflected faintly against the glass. He saw his reflection, small, alone, but not invisible. They might ignore him. They might mock him, but he was still here. He could still see himself. And for Elijah, that was a beginning. 2 weeks after the silent message appeared on his desk, Elijah thought he had grown used to Greywood's orchestrated quiet. But that morning, when he stepped into history class, he realized some silences had a purpose. And this time, that purpose had a target. Ms. Harrington, wearing her olive tweed blazer and short pearl necklace, stood at the front of the room with a look that signaled something both ceremonial and inevitable. "Dear students," she began, her voice ringing to the mahogany panel walls. "Next week, we will host the annual Scholarship Honor Performance, a long-standing Greywood tradition. As usual, second-year full scholarship students will be honored with the opportunity to present a special artistic talent before the entire school at Whitmore Hall." Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. He knew about this performance. Everyone did. It was what the rich kids called the showcase, an age-old ritual disguised as an honor. But everyone knew it was really a test, a chance for scholarship students to prove why they deserved to be at Greywood. Soft murmurs rippled through the room. A few glances shifted toward Elijah, not overtly malicious, but tinged with curiosity and the anticipation of entertainment. "Walker," Ms. Harrington said, turned and looked directly at him. "I hear your grandfather was a renowned jazz pianist in Oregon." The entire class turned to face him. Elijah nodded slightly, uneasy. "Then you'll perform a piano piece, won't you?" she asked. Not really a question. It was a command, wrapped in velvet under the guise of interest. I'm not sure Elijah began. "You have a few days to prepare," she cut in smoothly, smiling. Not everyone gets the privilege to participate in such a noble tradition. From the back of the class, Carter Langston chuckled. Maybe his granddaddy will possess him that night. More laughter followed. Elijah looked down at his desk. Another performance. But this time, it would take place under walnut paneling, chandelier lights, and the unspoken expectation that he would fumble, that he would fail, in front of the whole school. That night, dusk fell early over the Oregon mountains, cloaking the Greywood campus in a pale mist. While most students had returned to their dorms, Elijah Walker quietly made his way back to Whitmore Hall, the school's oldest auditorium, usually only open for formal occasions. Using an old access card secretly borrowed by Luca from the sound technician's office, they unlocked the back door. The heavy door creaked open, groaning as if it too was unaccustomed to students entering at this hour. Luca Park, his dorm mate and one of the few Asian students at Greywood, had often been dismissed as culturally incompatible with Greywood's elite. Maybe that's why she and Elijah had grown close. On the dust-covered stage sat a grand Steinway piano, silent and forgotten like an heirloom lost in time. The ceiling lights reflected off its ebony surface, making it resemble a sleeping beast. Elijah stared at the piano for a long while, restless. It had been years since he last touched the piano, not since his grandfather passed away. He hadn't sat at one since. The melodies once passed down with patience and tenderness, his childhood's safest refuge, now lingered only as a tangle of memory and regret. "You sure about this?" Luca whispered from the edge of the stage, her eyes filled with concern. "You don't owe them anything." Elijah didn't answer. He pulled out the piano bench, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. They trembled, nervous. His first feeling wasn't confidence. It was fear. Fear of losing connection to something that had once been part of him. But when the first notes rang out, low, soft, a little out of rhythm, memories began to return. Elijah closed his eyes. His hands slowly steadied, guided by muscle memory, as if his grandfather were sitting just behind him, nodding gently to the beat. The blues riffs his grandfather used to play echoed to the keys, rough but honest. Suddenly, the sound of the door bursting open startled them both. Elijah turned his head. It was Carter Langston, junior class student, captain of the baseball team, and heir to Langston Holdings, flanked by his two closest friends as they stepped inside. "This hall isn't open for scholarship kids," Carter smirked, his gaze briefly brushing past Luca before landing squarely on Elijah. "You actually plan to perform? Play a few sad notes and cry in the middle of the stage, huh?" Elijah clenched his hands. Luca started to say something, but he stopped it with a calm look. None of them knew that those words, meant to belittle, didn't break Elijah. If anything, they only made the music stronger. He placed his fingers back on the piano keys and kept playing, note by note, his quiet form of defiance. Carter stood there for a moment, scoffed, then turned and walked out. Luca looked up at the stage, eyes wide with surprise. She whispered, "Elijah, you're not just playing music, you're telling your whole story through it." And in that moment, Elijah knew if he had to stand before all of Greywood at the honor showcase, he wouldn't be playing out of obligation anymore. He would play, so they'd have no choice but to listen. In the days that followed, the lights of Whitmore Hall stayed dark at night, but behind the heavy copper-clad doors, a quiet journey had begun. Elijah Walker became a familiar shadow between 9 and 11 p.m. when all of Greywood Prep was asleep and he was alone in wordless conversation with the old grand piano. He didn't want anyone to see, not because he was afraid of mistakes, but because he feared being looked at with pity, or worse, the gleeful anticipation of failure. He just wanted time to find his rhythm again, uninterrupted by bias or behind-the-back whispers. Only Luca was always there beside him. She didn't say much, but always knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Once, she stood guard in the hallway for 2 straight hours, just so Elijah could practice without fear. "You know what?" Luca said one evening as they sat together on the back steps of the hall, their breath visible in the cold. "I always feel out of place here, but when you play, I feel like I've finally found something that feels like home." Elijah didn't know how to respond, but her words lingered in his mind, like a melody not yet finished. Another evening, as Elijah was practicing, a deep voice quietly rang out from the shadows. "Your left hand's too tense. Don't fight the piano, talk to it." Elijah spun around. It was Mr. Fletcher, the music hall supervisor, once a professional concert pianist in Oregon before switching to teaching at Greywood. Elijah had no idea how long he'd been standing there. "I've been hearing you play the past few nights, when you thought no one was paying attention. Don't be surprised, talent doesn't stay hidden. Not to someone who's lived off music." Mr. Fletcher stepped closer and pointed to the sheet music Elijah had been practicing. "Gershwin, huh? Tough choice for your first performance, but very distinctive." From that night on, Mr. Fletcher began showing up quietly every evening, never leaving a trace except for a single pencil laid atop the sheet music and a few small notes. "Ease up on the pedal here. Slightly quicken the tempo at the climax." Elijah never dared ask him about it, let alone say thank you. But he knew. Mr. Fletcher had seen something no one else had bothered to look for. Elijah wasn't just practicing, he was reclaiming himself. And during those late autumn nights, dim lights, empty halls, the piano echoing softly through the vaulted ceiling, Elijah began to change. He no longer played to avoid humiliation. He no longer practiced out of obligation. He was learning how to speak in the one language Greywood couldn't twist, music. On Friday evening, a strange hush fell over Greywood Prep, a silence unlike any other day. It was a silence of expectation, of judgment. Whitmore Hall glowed under the soft gleam of antique crystal chandeliers, suspended from carved wooden ceilings. Rows of red velvet benches gradually filled. Students dressed in formal attire. Teachers seated in neat rows at the front, and the honorary section gleamed with silver crests engraved with the names of founding families who had shaped the school more than a century ago. This was the honor showcase, a tradition since 1912, where sophomore scholarship students were required to perform an artistic talent before the entire school. It was framed as an honor, but everyone knew the truth. It was a silent test to see whether those who didn't come from legacy deserved the golden key to this world of privilege. Backstage, Elijah stood still in a tailored black suit, quietly altered by Luca to fit just right. He said nothing. He simply closed his eyes, back straight, hands resting on the polished lid of the Steinway. That piano, once covered in dust for years in the old hall, now seemed to be waiting for him to answer. The curtain opened. The announcement echoed across the chamber. Cool formal. Elijah Walker, sophomore student, performing Rhapsody in Blue, a rendition inspired by traditional jazz. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone let out a stifled laugh. Elijah walked out, slow and steady, as if he were stepping into the very heart of himself he'd fought so long to protect. In the front row, Ms. Harrington crossed her legs, her expression a mix of detached curiosity and subtle expectation for failure. Beside her, one of the board members, Mrs. Whitmore, a descendant of the school's founder, tilted her head and whispered to her neighbor, "That boy's playing Gershwin? Bold choice." Elijah sat at the piano bench. His hands hovered over the keys. And then, without signal, without fanfare, he began to play. The first notes came soft as breath, yet pulsed with quiet defiance. The bluesy rhythm flowed to the air like a warm current, at once grounded and unyielding. Elijah looked at no one. His eyes were closed, but his mind was more awake than it had ever been. The piano shifted, blending classical rigor with improvisational flair. An entire hall seemed to freeze. Those who had anticipated a clumsy performance subtly adjusted in their seats. A few faces on the judging panel leaned forward. Ms. Harrington squinted slightly, masking a flicker of unease, because what they were hearing didn't sound like the effort of a scholarship student. It sounded like a voice. Luca, seated near the back among the students, clenched her hands in her lap, eyes brimming. Mr. Fletcher stood quietly in the wings, arms folded, nodding slowly, as if each keystroke confirmed what he already knew. Elijah was ready. When Elijah first stepped onto stage, they expected him to stumble, but every note he played became a quiet, irrefutable answer. I belong here in my own way. The longer he played, the more Elijah seemed to melt into the rhythm. The melody swelled from tentative to commanding, flowing with raw emotion like a stream carving its way through stone, carrying with the echoes of childhood summers beside his grandfather. Dim porch lights, the hum of an old radio, his grandfather's raspy voice guiding him through chords with the patience of jazz him. By now, the auditorium had fallen completely silent. No more whispers, no more scoffs, just stillness, the kind that only arises when something has captured everyone far beyond expectation. But then, suddenly a harsh, screeching sound rang out from the tech booth in the back, feedback from the speaker, followed by a distorted burst of noise, as if someone had deliberately hijacked the signal. Elijah's hands froze. He looked up, eyes wide. For a split second, the hall descended into murmurs. One board member glanced around, frowning. "Elijah, continue," Mr. Fletcher said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped out from the wings, raising a hand, shielding the stage from the chaos behind. But Elijah didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood, slowly, walked toward the microphone at center stage, something no performer had ever done in the showcase's long, rule-bound history. "Some people don't want me to be heard," he said, voice low, steady. "But I won't let silence define me." Every word rang through the grand hall. No one moved. Elijah returned to the piano, this time with a straighter back, his gaze sweeping across the room as though inviting everyone in, no permission needed. He began again, but now it was no longer pure Gershwin. Elijah wove in flourishes of blues, long, aching notes tinged with the soul of New Orleans, melodies his grandfather once played in smoky bars long before Elijah was born. He rewound memory through music, each key whispering, "I'm still here. I'm still standing." The entire room held its breath. A girl in the front row clutched her friend's sleeve, eyes wide, transfixed. Luca looked at Elijah, her eyes shimmering. She knew this wasn't just a performance. This was a form of resistance through art, a declaration of identity in a place that revered tradition above truth. When the final note faded, no one dared to break the moment with premature applause. The silence lingered, not out of doubt, but because everyone was slowly digesting a truth that shattered expectations. This wasn't the scholarship kid playing a few decent notes, as they had silently anticipated. This was a true artist, telling his story in a language no one could refute. Elijah lifted his head. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply looked straight ahead. And in that gaze, the entire hall saw it clearly. Greywood was no longer a place where he needed permission to exist. He had claimed it, through music, through identity, through a quiet courage that didn't need to shout. Just one blues piece. The carved chandeliers above still cast their golden glow over the stage where Elijah had just left the piano. There was no thunderous ovation like usual, but the silence now echoed louder than any standing ovation ever could. It wasn't indifference. It was resonance, the aftermath of something beyond expectations. Elijah walked slowly down the steps leading off the stage. He felt the shift in the air. Eyes that once skimmed past him now followed him, no longer cold or dismissive, but curious. Still, he didn't smile. He simply returned to his usual seat in the back row, the one he had always chosen like a shadow, unseen. And then a voice rose, small yet full of weight. "Can I ask something?" A girl's voice, trembling but clear. It was Sophie Choi, a Korean freshman often nicknamed the Silent One from the East by the elite cliques. A girl who was frequently left out of study groups, who usually ate alone beneath the oak tree by the library. All heads turned. Sophie took a deep breath and looked up toward the faculty row. If Elijah had played poorly, would you still have praised him for trying? The air in the hall seemed to collapse for a second. Sophie didn't raise her voice. She wasn't angry, but her question struck straight at the heart of it all. Was recognition at Greywood ever truly earned, or was it only ever a privilege granted by prejudice? Ms. Harrington, seated in the front row, turned slowly, her face still composed, aristocratic, but her lips had gone stiff. Principal Whitmore cleared his throat, clearly hoping to dissolve the discomfort. But the moment had landed, and nothing could unring what had just been said. From the back rows, a few students began to nod subtly, whispering among themselves, not because they had suddenly become more decent, but because, for the first time, someone had cracked the shell of ceremony and formality that wrapped around this prestigious school. Elijah looked up and met Sophie's gaze. He gave a small nod, a silent thank you that needed no words. In the shimmering shadows of that historic hall, Greywood was no longer just a stage for the old, elite families. It was turning into something else. If only for a moment, a place where people began to ask themselves, are we judging students by effort or by lineage and polish? The ceremony ended in order, but the atmosphere as students filed out was anything but the same. Luca walked up beside Elijah as he stood at the bottom of the stone steps outside the hall. "They're starting to look at you differently," she said softly, her eyes bright. "It's okay. I just wanted them to listen," Elijah replied, calm and steady. "They did." Luca smiled. "And this time they won't forget." In a place where he had once been a shadow, it had only taken one perfectly placed note and one perfectly timed question to make the entire system pause and begin to ask the questions it had long avoided. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, the gray stone hallways of Greywood Preparatory Academy were quieter than usual, not because people had already forgotten the night before, but because none of them quite knew what to say. Elijah stepped out his dorm as always. Simple black coat, backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds tucked into his pocket. But this time, he noticed the silence around him had shifted. It wasn't apathy anymore. It was uncertainty. Eyes followed him, not with suspicion or contempt, but with an unspoken acknowledgement. He didn't know what they were thinking. He didn't need to. Elijah simply nodded at a group of seniors standing by the staircase, the same group that had ignored him for months. This time, one of them nodded back. At Greywood, that was a big change. The performance hadn't ended with thunderous applause or long-winded speeches of praise. Elijah hadn't stood center stage to say, "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." He hadn't apologized for standing out, hadn't faked humility to make anyone comfortable. He had bowed. A full, quiet bow, enough to say everything. No explanation, no slogan, no tears. Just a 16-year-old boy, standing tall before those who once believed he didn't belong. And from that moment on, Elijah became something Greywood had never seen before, a quiet symbol. Not because he won a competition, not because he defeated anyone, but because he dared to stand on his own terms without waiting for permission. In class, Ms. Harrington still lectured in her measured tone, but for the first time, when Elijah raised his hand, she nodded ever so slightly and called on him. Small things like that, in a place like Greywood, marked seismic shifts. That night, Elijah sat in the old music room by the Steinway grand piano. No one was watching, no one was waiting, and he played again, this time for himself. Because sometimes the greatest thing a person can do is refuse to back down in the face of the world's predetermined gaze. Time at Greywood didn't change overnight, and neither did Elijah. He still lived in the small room at the end of the third-floor hallway, the one with a window overlooking the fog-covered pines. He still arrived to class early, returned late to the dorms, still sat at the back of the American history classroom. But one thing was different. He no longer walked with his head down. Since that performance, Elijah didn't become a star, nor was he draped in accolades. But Mr. Fletcher began offering extra practice hours after school, and Elijah wasn't the only one in the music room anymore. A few students who once avoided him now stayed behind to listen, sometimes asking questions, or just quietly listening. Ms. Harrington never apologized, but in the first class of the new term, she assigned a new reading, The Influence of Jazz and Black Musicians on American History. And when a student frowned and asked, "What does this have to do with us?" she replied, "Because it's time we start listening to the voices we once ignored." The story of Elijah's performance spread like a whispered legend, not loud, not official, but present everywhere. In an English essay, a freshman girl wrote, "I never thought I could be moved so deeply by a piece of music." In social studies, the homeroom teacher played a recording of the performance, and for the first time, students were asked, what makes someone truly worth listening to? And then, the unthinkable happened. At the year-end graduation ceremony, under the glowing chandeliers of Whitmore Hall, the speakers played Take the A Train, a classic jazz standard rearranged by Elijah himself, seamlessly blending into the solo he once performed on stage. There was no grand introduction, no explanation needed, but the entire hall stood in silence, as if a new ritual had just been written. Greywood hadn't completely changed, but now it knew how to listen better. It knew how to ask better questions, and it understood that the first person to speak isn't always the one with the most to say. Elijah remained as quiet as ever, but when he passed the dining hall, someone nodded. When he walked the glass-lined corridor, he heard a classmate softly humming a jazz phrase, off-key, but with effort, and Elijah simply smiled, because he knew the greatest gift music leaves behind isn't on the stage. It's in the quiet change that echoes through every heart afterward.